Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I am delighted to welcome you all here tonight for a celebration of knowledge and discovery. It is a great honor for us to be able to host this lecture series. The McGaugh-Gerard Distinguished Lecture Series in Learning and Memory, as some of you may know, is supported by a joint endowment from Dr. James L. McGaugh, UCI Founding Faculty, and the estate of UCI's first Dean of the Graduate Division, Dr. Ralph Gerard. I'd like to take a moment to thank and acknowledge Dr. McGaugh for his foresight and generosity in supporting this series. Dr. McGaugh is actually backstage, so we're going to go ahead and give him a round of applause anyway. I'm sure he'll hear it. This series is a prime example of UCI leading the way when it comes to public education and service. We are very proud that UCI is again rated a top 10 public university according to U.S. News & World Report. And UCI is also rated #1 by both Forbes and Money magazines. So those are quite the accolades that we're very proud of them. We just launched our Brilliant Future campaign earlier this month, which is a very ambitious and exciting $2 billion campaign that will elevate UCI to even new heights. I want to thank Chancellor Gilman and Provost Lavernia for their steadfast leadership, and of course the incredible campaign leaders and staff who are committed to this important cause. So let's give them all a hand. I also want to thank all the people who work tirelessly to make sure that you have an amazing experience tonight, including all the staff and volunteers at the Center for the Neurobiology of Learning and Memory, as well as the Irvine Barkley Theater. I especially want to thank the president of the Irvine Barkley Theater, Mr. Jerry Mandel, for his support over the years. Jerry, I can't see Jerry right now because I can't see anything up here, but Jerry, if you can see me, it is a delight to be able to partner with you year after year to put on this incredible show, and thank you for your support. And again, let's give them all a round of applause. I want to share with you a story that Dr. McGaugh shared with me recently. It's a little bit of history. When he was setting up the very first lecture series for the CNLM, almost 25 years ago now, in 1995, he consulted with our community advisory board, many of whom are actually here today, so supporting the center for this many years. And they suggested that he host this series at the Irvine Barkley Theater. Now, this was a pretty daunting proposal. It was the first time that the center would put on something like this, and Jim actually admitted to me that it made him quite anxious. He said that he thought only 8 people would show up and sit in the front row. Now, of course, you can imagine what happened. The community showing was very strong, and since that time, we have had this lecture series be brought to a capacity audience at the Irvine Barkley Theater year after year after year. And now, almost 25 years later, you come out, 800 of you, to this theater on a Monday night when you could be watching Monday Night Football, but you chose to be here instead. That says a lot more about you than it says about us. But really, it is a testament to your incredible passion, your intellectual curiosity, your commitment to science, and most of all, your faith in UCI to deliver on its mission of public education and service. It is you that make it all worth it, and we're delighted to serve you and work alongside you to illuminate and inspire. So I want to take this moment to recognize you, our community, for inspiring us, encouraging us, and supporting us over the years. It is you who deserves the biggest round of applause. So let's hear it for you and your love of science. Now, up next, please help me welcome my dear friend, UCI Foundation trustee and longtime supporter at the Center for the Neurobiology of Learning and Memory, Dr. Hazem Shahabi.
Good evening. It is indeed an honor for me to introduce the founding director of the Center for Neurobiology of Learning and Memory, Dr. James McGaugh, distinguished emeritus professor in the Department of Neurobiology and Behavior at the School of Biological Sciences. Dr. McGaugh has a long history at UC Irvine. We first met while on the platform party during President Barack Obama's commencement speech in 2014. We struck a conversation at the time, and I'm privileged to call him a friend ever since. Dr. McGaugh is one of the founding UCI faculty going back to 1965, and his 55-year journey at UCI has been nothing short of inspirational. He's served as founding chair of the Department of Psychobiology, the first department of its kind in the world, now named Neurobiology and Behavior. He's served as dean of the School of Biological Sciences, vice chancellor for academic affairs, and provost and executive vice chancellor. He was just telling me backstage that the most fun he's had was during his tenure at the CNLM, that it was much better than being provost. Dr. McGaugh is indeed a pillar in the field of learning and memory. He has published over 575 publications. He has received over 34 distinctions, including the UCI Medal of Honor and the Extraordinaires Award given by the UCI Alumni Association. His early work demonstrated how memories are stored and how emotions can make memories stronger. He's also credited for the discovery of a memory ability called highly superior autobiographical memory, a rare ability which allows a person to remember in detail every moment of their lives, a blessing and a curse at the same time. Even with these incredible contributions to the field of neuroscience, Dr. McGaugh still believes that his greatest achievement is creating opportunities for community dialogue and enrichment through programs like the Barclay Lecture Series. In fact, this community has been so supportive and enthusiastic about these efforts. We have had at capacity audience at this great auditorium for over 25 years. Let's keep the magic alive. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. James McGaugh.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming, all 2,000 of you in room for 800. It's really remarkable. It's been mentioned already, but I mention again. Consider this. It is a Monday night. You have lots of things you could be doing. In a place of that, you come here to get a lecture. It either says something about us or something about you. I'm not sure. Now, this lecture series and this lecture in particular focus, of course, on memory. I want you to think about it with me for a second. Memory. Memories are us. We are our memories. By the time I finished that sentence, the first word in that sentence was a memory. And somehow we stitched that together. And we stitched that together with what happened to you earlier today and yesterday and the day before and last week and last year and so on. And we have a record of our experiences, and we can use that record to make decisions about the future. I mean, it's just truly remarkable that without memory, we would be essentially vegetables, or maybe worse, I don't know. So this is another lecture which focuses on our understanding memory and how our brains work to create memory. And I'm delighted to introduce tonight's distinguished speaker because understanding memory has been his life's work. That's what he's done all his life, is to work on memory. Professor Daniel Schacter is from Harvard University, and he is a world's leader in understanding the cognitive neuroscience of memory. That is not only memory, but what brain does to enable memory. He's a world leader in this respect. He has authored several highly recognized books, and you know them, and he'll be talking about some of them. He was an author of one of them while he was still a graduate student. Can you imagine that? A graduate student and a published book. I find that awesome, really, truly awesome. He has received many distinguished awards. I'll only mention a couple of them. He is elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he is a member of the National Academy of Science, two of the most distinguished awards that any scientist can achieve. But most of all, and most importantly, he had made many, many pioneering contributions to understanding the cognitive and neuroscience of memory, and that have significantly shaped our understanding of the nature and the functioning of memory. Truly enormous contributions that are well recognized throughout the world. Please join me in recognizing and welcoming, giving a warm Irvine welcome to Professor Daniel Schacter.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Jim McGaugh, for that very kind introduction, and thanks to Mike Gyasa and to everybody else who associated with the center, was involved in inviting me here. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. I gave a talk at the very beginning of the public lecture series here way back in 1995, so that's almost 25 years from now. A lot of things have changed. When I came here in January 1995, there was no World Wide Web. And I had a lot more hair on my head, but things do change. So it's a pleasure to be back and to talk to you about one of the aspects of memory, I think, that makes it so interesting to those of us who study it. And that's the basic idea that memory is not just a simple recording, video recording, or photograph of experience. It's a much more complicated, constructive process that is sometimes prone to error. And those errors can often be highly revealing in terms of telling us something about how memory works. And that aspect of memory was something that really became increasingly of interest to me, actually in the years immediately after, when I was here speaking way back in 1995. And psychologists and neuroscientists have long recognized that memory is prone to errors of various kinds, forgetting and distortion. But it occurred to me then that nobody had really organized the literature from the perspective of trying to come up with some kind of classification scheme for what are the different kinds of memory errors that exist. So I kind of set that as my task, and over a period of a couple of years of reading and thinking about the literature, my best read of the literature was that there were 7 basic categories of memory errors, which by analogy to the 7 ancient deadly sins, I called the 7 sins of memory. And I wrote an article about that, published in 1999 in the American Psychologist, and I think our clicker here is that hooked up? Just 1 second, just want to make sure, is this? Oh, okay, that's all right. It's all right. So we've got the 1999, I wrote an article called The 7 Sins of Memory, and then expanded that into a book in 2001. And what I'm going to do tonight is first briefly review what the 7 sins are. I know that some of you know what they are and could probably give an interesting lecture on them yourselves, but not all of you do. So I'm going to tell you what they are, but the focus of this lecture is going to be on what's happened since this book was written back in 2001 regarding the 7 sins of memory. What have we learned that's interesting, that's worth knowing? And I'll try to tell you about a few of the things I think they're interesting that have happened since 2001. So let's begin by just reviewing what are the 7 sins as I talked about them. Well, the first 3 have to do with different kinds of forgetting. What I call transience refers to the fact that all other things being equal, memories tend to become decreasingly accessible over time. I think we all have a sense of that from our everyday experience. Memories are subject to transience to varying degrees. A second kind of forgetting I refer to as absent-mindedness. So here, rather than fading of memory over time, we have kind of a breakdown at the interface of attention and memory, lapses of attention that can result in forgetting to do things. So these absent-minded memory errors are kind of the irritating everyday errors that we all experience, or at least I do. Where did I put my glasses? Where did I put my keys? That's not information fading over time. That's information that never gets into memory because we're distracted and doing something else, or when we want to carry out an action, we don't have the cue that we need at the moment we carry out the action in order to do that correctly. The information is there, we just don't use it. Blocking refers to a kind of forgetting in which we're paying attention, unlike absent-mindedness. The information hasn't faded out of memory, but we can't get to that information we seek at the moment, the temporary inaccessibility of stored information. The final four sins, those first three I think of as sins of omission. The final four I think of as sins of commission, where some kind of memory is present, but it's either wrong or unwanted. So misattribution I define as happening when we attribute memories to an incorrect source. That results in a really interesting phenomenon we'll talk about in more detail tonight, known as false recognition. Suggestibility refers to implanted memories, when suggestions corrupt memory through implantation. You have the world leader on that topic here, Elizabeth Loftus. I'll say more about her important work a little bit later. Bias refers to retrospective distortions produced by current knowledge and beliefs. When what we currently know, believe, and feel skews or biases our memories of past events. You have another leader on that topic here, and Linda Levine. And finally, persistence, and this refers to unwanted recollections that people can't forget. So disturbing experiences that keep us up at night. I refer to as persistence. So those are the 7 sins. But there's one point I want to make before we start going into each of them in a little bit more detail. A couple I'm only going to be able, in the interest of time. You may miss Monday Night Football, but I don't want to keep you here so you miss next Sunday's game. So, we can't spend 20 minutes as I'd like to on each of them. So, but we will go through each and talk, at least say a few words about each and what's happened since 2001. But there's another broader point that I need to make first, that the memory researchers here are already probably squirming in their seats a little. I talk about 7 sins of memory as if memory is one thing, but it's not. One thing we know is that there are many different kinds of memory. So this is kind of a generic taxonomy of memory taken from a textbook that, if they squint a little bit, most researchers in the field would probably roughly agree with, that we can make a big distinction between short-term and long-term memory, where short-term memory in psychology is referred to memory that lasts just for a few seconds. Everything else is long-term memory. And within the domain of long-term memory, we can make other distinctions. So there's a pretty big, broad distinction between explicit memory or declarative memory on the one hand, that's a memory that we can call to mind, and implicit or non-declarative memory on the other, that's a non-conscious effects or expressions of memory. And then within explicit memory, we can make a further distinction between episodic memory, that's our memory for the events of our lives, and memory for facts or semantic memory. When I'm talking about the 7 sins of memory, I'm really mostly talking about episodic memory and a little bit about semantic memory. I'm not talking at all about non-declarative memory, but that's a whole other interesting and important domain of memory research. Okay, with that background established, let's move on and talk a little bit about transience. This is a good place to begin with because one of the fundamental findings on the transience of memory came from what most people think of as the very first systematic experimental study of memory that was published way back in 1885 by this fellow, Hermann Ebbinghaus, a German psychologist, who studied himself. He studied his own memory. He didn't have any university undergraduates participating in his experiments, so he did it all on himself. And he did something, I guess, relatively boring. He set about memorizing lists of nonsense syllables, and he had reasons why he wanted to do that. And then he would wait various times after learning and try to get a measure of how much he had retained from that learning. And that's what we see here. The measure he used is something called savings. We don't have to go into the detail here, but on the y-axis, a higher number means more retention, 100% retention down to 0. And he's and here it's plotted against time. And as you can see, the most striking thing is that there's a very rapid fall off in retention during the first hour. So if he waits an hour to test himself on these nonsense syllables, he already lost a lot of the initial learning, and then the rate of forgetting kind of slows down over time. And this Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, while there are exceptions to it, and it depends on the materials you use and tests you give, that is more or less a pretty good description of typical forgetting that we see over time across a wide variety of situations. We also know that there's an extreme form of transience that has taught us a lot about how memory works, and that comes from observations of amnesic patients. So again, going back to some of the classic foundational findings in our field, way back in the 1950s, as many of you will know, there was a path-breaking paper published by the surgeon William Beecher Scoville and Brenda Milner, the neuropsychologist shown here, on patient HM, who was a young man at the time who had a bad and worsening case of epilepsy, and it was deemed that parts of his brain had to be taken out in order to prevent the further spread of that epilepsy. Those parts of the brain included the hippocampus and other nearby regions in the inner or medial part of the temporal lobe. We didn't know at that time that those regions are critical for establishing memories that hold up over time, that can be retained over time. But sadly, HM's case told us that these regions are very important, because after the surgery, HM was normal in many respects, but what he couldn't do was establish new, explicit, declarative memories that he could maintain over time. They would fade away about as quickly as he tried to encode them. So that's an extreme form of transience, and there have been hundreds of studies of other patients since then. HM passed away about a decade ago when it was revealed to the world that his full name was Henry Mollison. And that's the hippocampus looking in through the temporal lobe of the brain. And it's not just the hippocampus that was removed in HM, other parts of the medial temporal lobe were, and there's been hundreds of studies, and people like Mike Yassa and Craig Stark here at UC Irvine have been leaders in studying and contributing to our understanding of how the hippocampus impacts memory and transience of memory. Now, an important question is that we'd all like the answer to is, what can we do to slow down forgetting over time? There are lots of things that we want to remember that fade away over time. And so I want to tell you now about one phenomenon that's come on the scene since 2001 that is highly relevant here. It's something that psychologists knew about for a long time, but hadn't really taken seriously and hadn't really studied very intensively until the early 2000s, and that is known in the literature as the testing effect. And this refers to the interesting observation that testing of memory not only assesses what we know, what's in memory. When we give someone a memory test, it's not only informing us about what the person remembers and forgets, but can change it. And in an important paper published back in 2006, the psychologist Roddy Roediger at Washington University in St. Louis and Jeff Karpicki published a paper where they were able to show that testing memory can enhance later performance even more than studying something again and again. Testing yourself can be more effective. So let's actually just look a little bit at the procedure they used, and I'll show you the results and how it relates to the transience of memory. So in their experiment, students studied prose passages, and then the critical thing is they either got to study them again, and you might intuitively think, gee, that's great, I got a second crack at studying them, it's really gonna boost my memory a lot, or you take a test about the passage. Then after that, you have a final test in which you recall the passages on their own. That's what psychologists call a free recall test. Try to remember everything you can from the passage. And they scored this free recall in terms of the number of idea units from the story that someone could remember. And it was rated by two people who agreed on what an idea unit is. And the critical manipulation here is that this final test, after they either restudied or or took intermediate tests on the passage was given either after a 5-minute delay, the free recall test, 2 days later, or a week later. Between subjects means just that these were different groups of people. So what happened? Well, if we look at see the dark blue bar on the left, that's where you get to study it twice. The light, sort of more purple bar on the right is where you study and test before the final free recall test. And as you can see, when testing is done, the final free recall test is given 5 minutes after either you study twice or you did study test. There's not much of a difference, a slight advantage actually for the study condition. That might encourage some people here to cram for their next exam. However, what I really want to focus you on is the fact that 2 days later, that is now flipped dramatically, and those who studied and tested are much better off, and that holds out to 1 week. They're still forgetting in both cases, but you can see that the forgetting is cut in half by the testing manipulation. So that's a pretty dramatic impact on the transience of memory and suggests that we would all do well to try to test ourselves on information that we want to be able to retain over time. Now, let me briefly mention another I find very interesting development related to the transience of memory that you heard referred to in the introduction of Dr. McGaugh, and that's the phenomenon of highly superior autobiographical memory that he and his colleagues have elucidated in such an interesting way over the past 10, 15 years or so. And what I want to suggest is that in my terminology, we might think of this HSAM, or highly superior autobiographical memory group, as exhibiting a naturally occurring anti-transience phenomenon, kind of the opposite of the amnesic patients before. That we talked about briefly before. So, as many of you probably know, being here in Irvine, highly superior autobiographical memory originated in a McGaugh and colleagues study of a woman by the name of Jill Price, who contacted Dr. McGaugh because she experienced this extraordinary and perhaps burdensome ability to remember virtually everything that had ever happened to her in her life. And she wrote a book about it called The Woman Who Can't Forget. Well, it turned out she wasn't the only person, and the group here has done a really good job of identifying people who are characterized by this HSAM syndrome. They've learned a lot of things about them. The one thing I want to focus on comes from a paper they published in 2016, in which they were comparing a group of highly superior autobiographical memory folks. And again, what this means is that these people, if you ask them what happened on November 16th, 1994, if they were adults then, they'll tell you. And in Jill Price's case, you could verify that against the diary that she kept. Probably not many of you do remember what you're doing on November 16th, 1994, or any other date in the remote past of that nature. But these people have no problem doing it. What was interesting in this study is that they found that the HSAM individuals were recalling more details of everyday personal events that happened a month, a year, and 10 years ago, but not a week ago. In other words, one way to interpret that is that there is a slowing down of the forgetting curve for personal events, because it's really personal events where they exhibit this extreme form of memory. They're not particularly good at memorizing meaningless information or word lists or anything like that. So what we might have here is a kind of a condition that is telling us something possibly important about transience in memory and when transience is not observed. We don't know exactly why this happens. Linking back to the testing effect, we might think that these are folks who are thinking a lot about their past experience, testing themselves, if you will, about their past experience. And we know from the work on the testing effect, that slows down forgetting. So maybe that's contributing in some way to the reduction in transience that we see in HSAM. So just a thought about how that links to transience as I've defined it in the context of the 7 sins. Okay, let's move on to absent-mindedness. Again, the breakdown of attention at the interface of attention and memory. And I want to relate an everyday example from New Zealand of a bank robbery that went bad. And this was a video camera that captured this guy who was, I guess, sort of disguised by his hat and his glasses, but he was missing two things that robbers usually bring to them to bank robberies: a mask and a gun. He had forgotten his mask and his gun. So this was written up in the New Zealand Herald. Two men have had a night in the cells to reflect on the importance of planning after one of them forgot his mask and gun while allegedly attempting an armed holdup. You can't do that without a gun. So was this transience in memory? Probably not. We don't know for sure, of course, but probably not. If you had asked this guy, well, did you mean to bring your gun and mask? He probably said, oh my God, I forgot my gun and mask. That information no doubt was in memory, but in absent-mindedness, what happens is there's a breakdown at the interface of attention and memory. He's focusing on other things, and he is not remembering something he should be able to easily remember if his attention was focused in the right place. There are many examples of this, but again, we're talking about mostly about what's happened since 2001. So I want to link this up to a really interesting phenomenon that we all know about from our everyday lives that is now termed in the psychological literature mind wandering. Okay? Mind wandering occurs when people engage in thoughts that are unrelated to a primary cognitive task. This is something we all know from experience. We zone out, our minds wander. Highway hypnosis, when we're driving, we're thinking about other things. We don't realize we've just gone 20 miles and so on. But it's not something that psychologists really studied intensively until really the last 10 or 15 years. And the work of the psychologists Jonathan Smallwood and Jonathan Schooler, this is just one of many articles they've written on this, has kind of launched this field, and it has many interesting implications. What I want to focus on, though, is just one of them, and that has to do with the fact that when we don't attend to a primary task, we are not devoting sufficient attention to it to create a new memory that will last over time. So I'm not going to focus so much on the content of mind wandering, but more on the impact of mind wandering on memory and why we can think of it as a kind of absent-minded error. So let me give you an example that is relevant to all the college professors here in the audience. We often face a group of students like this, armed with their laptops. We like to think they're hanging on our every word, recording our every thought, but we suspect that maybe behind those laptops, there's online shopping, there's YouTube, there's Facebook, there's Instagram, God knows what. That's what we kind of fear. Well, it turns out our worst fears have been confirmed by scientific studies. So in a review I wrote with a couple of colleagues a few years ago on mind wandering and lectures, among many studies that we cited was one out of Sweden, in which they actually probed students about what they were thinking about at various points in a psychology lecture. Are you thinking about the lecture? Write that down. If you're thinking about something else, write that down. The sad kind of finding for many of us is that about a third of the time when an auditory probe sounded, they were mind wandering off thinking about dinner last night or the next date or the next movie. And that mind wandering increased from the beginning to the end of the lecture. So 44% of the time by the end of the lecture, they were mind wandering. And not shockingly, but importantly, that increase in mind wandering or propensity for mind wandering was negatively correlated with learning. The more you mind wandered, the worse you did in the course. Now, I'm sure that nobody in this audience is mind wandering during this lecture, so this does not apply to you. But if you know anybody who's in college or might have some vested interest in learning how not to mind wander, this is an important question. Is there anything that can be done to reduce mind wandering and increase attention? How can we get our students to be more focused on the lecture and less so on unrelated content? Well, here I'm going to go back to the testing effect that we just talked about, but a different version of it, a different manifestation of it. So we already talked about how testing strengthens memory, can fight off transience. If you give tests to people, it was shown in some studies using word list. If you tell people, hey, you're going to be intermittently tested on these words, and then you follow through and you intermittently test them, they stay much more engaged than if they're not tested. And to the point that if they expect to be tested and they are tested, the attention to the material is increased so that when you give them a test on a final novel list of words, they do better than a group that hasn't been tested on new information because they're attending more and presumably mind-wandering less. So we wondered a few years ago in a study led by Carl Spooner when he was a postdoc in my lab, can this interpolated testing, which is what we and others have called it, reduce mind-wandering during lectures and improve retention of information? So how do we do that? In our case, we were actually interested both in live lectures and classroom learning and also online learning, so we ended up using a videotape of a 21-minute statistics lecture, and I have to admit it is pretty boring, but that was good for the purposes of the study. And we divided that into 4 segments, separated either by control trials where people were just doing math problems, or by brief tests, or critically by restudy. So one group got to restudy some of the information that was just presented in a lecture. Another group just did math problems that were unrelated, and the other group was tested on the lecture content. And the participants in each condition are instructed at the beginning of the lecture that they would be divided into 4 segments and that it would be randomly determined whether they were going to be tested. That was the only deception involved in the study. It wasn't randomly determined. Some people were tested after each segment, others were not, and they were told there would be a final test, and that was true, there would be. They were also told that they could take notes if they wanted to, because we're interested in how note-taking was affected, and that they would be occasionally probed about whether they were mind-wandering during the lecture or focused on the lecture. And we defined what we meant by mind-wandering. We said, it's fine, just report to us what you're thinking about. If you're thinking about the lecture, fine. If you're thinking about something else, that's also fine. And so everybody was probed once in each lecture segment. So what happened? Well, if we look over here on the left, what we see is the proportion of probes, auditory probes, where the 3 groups, the tested group, the restudied group, and that non-tested group who's just doing math problems, were asked about mind-wandering. And what we see for the restudied group and non-tested group, we pretty much replicate exactly what was found in that Swedish study of in-classroom lectures, about 35, 40% mind-wandering rate. They're not really consistently focusing on the lecture, but importantly, we cut that in half in the interpolated testing group, because they're getting tested, they're more engaged, they want to focus more on the material and do well in the test. They took a lot more notes in the tested group, again, a measure of engagement, and then critically, they remembered more from the very final segment of the lecture. That's new material, and so again, that's an effect on attention. So they're attending more, mind-wandering less, getting more out of the lecture. We've done a bunch of follow-ups on this. I'll only just mention briefly one that was led by Helen Jing when she was a graduate student in my lab, where we replicated everything I just told you about and also found that when you're tested, you're better able to integrate information from different parts of a lecture. So that was a measure of integration in the tested group versus the group that's getting the same material shown to them, and the retested group is showing a lot more ability to link material across the lecture segments. So we think that this is promising, these are promising findings, that there are ways to overcome this form of absent-minded mind wandering that occurs a lot during classroom lectures. Okay, I'm just going to say a very few words about blocking. Blocking is a very interesting, intriguing phenomenon, refers to the temporary inaccessibility of stored information. I'm sure most people here have had a tip of the tongue experience, right? Where information's on the tip of your tongue, you know it really bothers you that you can't get it out, and then it may come to you sometime later. And that's the most common form of blocking, and as shown in this little cartoon, it can be so subjectively upsetting that we wish we had a surgeon who could take that thing off the tip of our tongue. It bothers us so much. And it's important because blocking of this kind, tip of the tongue experiences, particularly for the names of people and for proper names and proper nouns, are one of the most common complaints of memory failure as we get older. And the lesson that proper nouns are very subject to blocking was learned the hard way in a moment on TV that you may remember. This is back in 2011, sort of seems like another era now, but when Rick Perry was running for president, and he had his famous oops moment when he stated with great conviction, it's 3 agencies of government that are gone when I get there: commerce, education, and the, what's the third one there? He couldn't come up with it. It was the department that he's running now, ironically, the energy department. He couldn't come up with it. And I'm going to call that blocking. I'm going to give him credit for blocking because the alternatives are even worse. And he did come up with it later on, to his credit, so it's not that he didn't know it at all, or it wasn't transience, it wasn't absent-mindedness. He's focused on trying to retrieve. He just couldn't do it, and it had consequences for him. Larry Sabato, the political scientist at University of Virginia, said that, to my memory, Perry's forgetfulness is the most devastating moment of any modern primary. So it was a costly memory error, and the fact that it was a proper noun, again, fits with those are the kinds of items that are most prone to blocking. And if you actually go back and read the original 7 Sins book in 2001, even though this didn't happen until later, I talk about some of the psychological models that attempt to account for that, which are very interesting. But that's all I have time for on blocking tonight. Okay, let's now move out of the sins of commission into the sins of, out of the sins of omission into the sins of commission. And we're going to start with misattribution, which is something that my lab has worked on quite a bit over the last 15 or 20 years. And I want to start with an everyday example I know that some of you are familiar with and have even heard me talk about before. And this goes back to 1995, a few months after I gave my lecture here. We had the horrific Oklahoma City bombing, and some of you may remember that in the weeks after the bombing, there was a nationwide manhunt for 2 men. They were called at that time John Doe number 1 and John Doe number 2. John Doe number 1, of course, turned out to be Timothy McVeigh, who was convicted and executed for his role in the bombing. John Doe number 2 was this guy. At least that's the sketch of him that was circulated. And they never found a John Doe number 2 who was involved in the bombing, who assisted McVeigh, who looked like that. There was somebody else involved in the bombing, but it wasn't this guy. So who was this guy, John Doe number 2, and why was there a nationwide manhunt for him? Well, it turned out that John Doe number 2 was the product of a kind of classic form of memory misattribution. A guy by the name of Tom Kensinger was present at the body shop where McVeigh rented the van that he used to carry out the bombing. And he said McVeigh was there, and he gave a very detailed description of this other guy who was there with him. Well, what was eventually patched together was that this guy was in that body shop, all right, but he was there the next day with somebody who kind of looked like McVeigh. And Kensinger misattributed his memory of him from one day to the next, and probably enhanced by the fact that he was with somebody who looked like McVeigh. So this was the final report of the Oklahoma City County grand jury. We believe that the most likely identity of John Doe number 2 was that of Todd Bunting, who I just showed you, who with Michael Hertig was in Elliott's body shop on April 18th, 1995, I think a couple of days after McVeigh was there. The similarity of Hertig to the composite of John Doe number 1, which was McVeigh, and the similarity of Bunting to the composite of John Doe Doe number 2 are remarkable, particularly when you take into account Bunting's tattoo of a Playboy bunny on his upper left arm and the fact that he was wearing a black t-shirt and a Carolina Panthers ball cap, all of which Kensinger remembered about the non-existent John Doe number 2, who was this innocent man who was at the body shop the next day. So that's kind of a paradigmatic example of a memory misattribution and an eyewitness identification. And of course, we know that these kinds of things have profound legal consequences. So through the work of the Innocence Project, where they've broken down the cases in which people have been exonerated of crimes based on DNA evidence, and they've looked at the contributing causes based on over 300 cases. This is their latest published graph at their website. Over 70% of those innocent people, there was eyewitness misidentification as one of the key contributing causes, more than any of the other causes. For those who want to read a really excellent discussion of the first 250 cases, I would send you to Brandon Garrett's book, Convicting the Innocent, really excellent book. So memory misattributions can have huge costs in society. So what have we learned about them? Well, I want to just tell you about one little narrow slice of memory misattribution research that has grown up over the last 20, 25 years. It began just before I wrote the book on the 7 sins, but I'm going to tell you about some more recent developments. And this is a paradigm that will be familiar to the psychologists in the audience, known as the DRM, or Diess-Roediger-McDermott paradigm. Very simple paradigm, was discovered by the psychologist James Diess back in 1959. He wrote a brief paper about it that nobody really paid attention to, and then it was rediscovered and expanded by Roddy Roediger, who we talked about earlier, and Kathleen McDermott in an important paper published in 1995. So now we refer to it as DRM, to give them all some credit. So what is it? Well, it's very straightforward. If you're a participant in one of these experiments, you hear a bunch of words that are all related to one another and to a word that is not on the list: candy, sour, sugar, bitter, good taste, tooth, so on and so forth. So you're given a list like that. You're given another list where all the words have something to do with being sweet, for example. Then you get a memory test where you're tested with words that were on the list, like taste, and you should say, yes, I recognize that word. It's an old word. It was on the list, and most people don't have a problem with that. You try to keep the subjects honest, so you throw in some unrelated words that weren't presented, such as point, and most people can easily reject that and say, no, point was not on the list. And then here's where things get interesting. You throw in the associatively related theme word. It's sometimes called a critical lure or false target, sweet. So that wasn't on the list, but all these words are strongly associated to sweet. And the phenomenon here is that people will swear up and down that sweet was on the list when, in fact, it wasn't. So here are just some simple data from an experiment that was run in my lab many years ago by Ken Norman when he was a graduate student with me, with young adults in their 20s, older adults in their 70s and 80s. And we're looking at the proportion of old responses where people saying that word was on one of those lists that I just heard. And for the true target, like taste, both old and young are almost 80% of the time correct. For the unrelated words like point, where you're supposed to say no, I'm not showing the results here, but maybe 10% of the time they'll claim it was old. So people have no problem rejecting that. The important finding here is that they're false alarming through the roof to that word sweet. And the older adults are doing it even a bit more frequently than the younger adults. And this is a very robust finding, been studied from multiple perspectives, replicated many times, mostly with young adults, but also with older adults. So what's going on here, and why do the older adults exhibit more of this? Well, one idea is that false recognition of the related lure word is based on memory for semantic information and relations, because all these words are related to sweet. So all that semantic information is getting activated in your mind, and it convinces you that the word sweet was there. And maybe older adults retain this information and rely on it even more than younger adults. Okay, So all that was known back in 2001. Now I don't want to tell you just about one study that I was involved in as a collaborator that I think is very cool and very interesting. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on it. I'm going to ask for your patience in going through this, because if you stay with me, it's a very neat finding regarding the brain basis of their possible brain basis, or one brain basis of this phenomenon. Okay, so here's the reasoning for this study. If semantic information and relations, as we just said, if they're critical in driving this DRM false memories, then the brain regions involved in representing semantic information should play a role in false recognition of the critical lure word. That just makes a lot of sense. If it's based on your retention of semantic information, then parts of the brain that have to do with representing semantic information should play a role. Well, there is one part of the brain, not the only part of the brain that's involved in semantics, but one that has been studied quite a bit, and it's referred to as the temporal pole, or TP. Some people call it the semantic hub of the brain, because both neuroimaging studies and patient studies have pointed to this anterior front part of the temporal lobe, the temporal pole, as being very important for comprehension of the relations among concepts and words and the like. The left temporal pole is implicated in a really interesting finding, a phenomenon, and sad phenomenon known as semantic dementia. That's not like Alzheimer's disease, where it's a across-the-board loss of memory and then virtually all cognition, but rather it's more focused pathology, where these patients have great difficulty just understanding meanings of words, relations among concepts, and so forth. And the left temporal pole is a critical player in that. So in this study, we're going to ask a question about whether the left temporal pole has anything to do with the DRM false recognition phenomenon. This was a study that was carried out in London. I was a collaborator on it. The two people who did most of the work were Martin Chadwick and Demis Hassabis. It's published a couple of years ago. So computational models of semantic cognition, this is just elaborating on what I said, hold that concepts are represented by a kind of similarity-based code in the temporal pole semantic hub. So the idea there is simple, just that concepts that are semantically related are coded in the temporal pole and are represented neurally there in some form. So neural representations of words on a DRM list should reflect the semantic relatedness between those words. You saw all the words in the suite list were related to one another. The idea would be that maybe the temporal pole is coding neural representations of the relations among all those words and the relation to the false target word, to suite. So that leads to a simple prediction. The probability that a given DRM list will generate a false memory should be directly related to the degree of neural overlap between that lure word and the studied words in the temporal pole. So let me say one more thing to make this very clear, this logic. Not all DRM lists yield high levels of false memory. Some of them do, like the suite list. That's a great one for eliciting a false memory of suite. This list, bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, etc., that will get people to swear up and down that sleep was on the list. But others, like the butterfly list, don't really work very well. You don't get many false memories of butterfly after you give a moth, insect, wing, bird, and fly. So some lists yield few false memories, others yield gangbusters false memories. The question is that related, the difference in false memories, to the neural representation of these words in the temporal pole, the semantic relations of these words? So I'm not going to go into any of the technical details. This used a kind of analysis of brain imaging data known as representational similarity analysis, and that measures the similarity of neural patterns in the brain elicited by one word versus another. You can ask how similar are the patterns elicited by two different words. They could be highly similar or they could be really dissimilar. And so in the study used neuroimaging, functional MRI, to measure the neural overlap between each set of DRM words and their associated critical lure words when people are in a brain scanner and when the words are presented during a semantic encoding task. So in this particular experiment, they're actually seeing the critical lure words, so we're not going to get false memories out of that part of the experiment because they see sweet and they see a few other words from that list. We just want to be able to measure the brain response to those words to the extent that we can use this kind of analysis to see how close are the representations of those words. How similar are the neural patterns of the critical list items to the word sweet, for example. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at how that measurement of neural similarity, pattern similarity, relates to false memory likelihood across the different DRM word lists. And we're not getting false memory out of those subjects. We're getting false memory estimates for each list based on a database that's compiled a number of years ago that gives you false memory estimates for each of these lists for across hundreds of people. So if I look in your brain and I measure how similar, and try to measure how similar sweet is to all those other words on the list versus how similar butterfly is, can I predict the false memory rate in other people to sweet versus butterfly? And I wouldn't have gone through all this if the answer to that question was no. The answer to that question is yes, thankfully. So I'm just going to show you one data point. And what this is showing is that the degree of measured of neural overlap in the temporal pole, which is lesser to greater, is correlated with the probability of false recognition by other people. So if there's more overlap in the temporal pole between a lure word and the list items, that predicts that other people will have a greater false memory rate to that lure word than one in which there's less neural overlaps. I think that's a pretty cool finding. No other region in the brain showed this relationship. So I think that's one step forward that we've taken with brain imaging here to understanding that this brain region that's really important in representing semantic information is also allowing the brain to play a trick on us in getting fooled into a false memory of sweet being on a list when it wasn't, just because it's so highly similar to the other neural representations of words on that list in this brain region. Okay, so that raises another question about neuroimaging. The field has been using functional MRI and other brain scanning techniques for many years now. Can neuroimaging distinguish between true and false memories based on brain activity? I just showed you some evidence that neuroimaging can tell us a little bit, perhaps, about the neural correlate or possible neural basis of one particular false memory effect, but can it distinguish between the two? If I put you in a scanner and I scan you and you're remembering that taste was on the list correctly versus you're remembering that sweet was on the list and that's a false memory, can brain activity distinguish those two? Again, the answer is yes, and this is not really new news, but I'm just showing you one brain scanning result from a study published in 2008 that actually replicated an early study from my group that showed that if you scan people when after they've had a bunch of those DRM lists, that there is more activity in some brain regions here in the left hemisphere that are involved in auditory and phonological processing, more for a true memory than a false memory. So more activity in these regions when you correctly say that taste was on the list versus when you incorrectly claim that sweet was on the list. And the idea was in these studies that there may be some kind of sensory reactivation going on because you actually heard the word taste earlier. And now you see when you're given that word visually on a test, there's evidence of more activity in brain regions linked with auditory and phonological information. That kind of makes sense. And there are lots of other laboratory studies now that show this basic effect in various forms. I won't go into them other than to say that I think it's pretty clear that for laboratory paradigms and groups of subjects, you can make a distinction in the brain between true and false memories. Okay, of certain kinds. Does that mean that we're now ready to go into the courtroom and to use neuroimaging? Could we have, for example, put Tom Kessinger in a brain scanner and realize from his pattern of brain activity that he had a false memory of John Doe number 2 in the sense that he mixed up the context? That's a different kind of memory misattribution than we've been talking about, but basic idea is the same. Well, about 6 years ago, I was fortunate to join forces with your own Elizabeth Loftus and to write an article about this issue when we're asking the question of what cognitive neuroscience can contribute to our understanding of memory in the law. And one of the issues that we took on was exactly the question that I mentioned. We know from laboratory studies you can put people in the scanner and you can tell the difference between true and false memories of certain kinds in brain activity. Are we ready to use it in the courtroom? And our answer was a cautious one, was no, we don't think so. Well, why didn't we think so? There are a few different reasons. Number one, there are a lot of differences between these lab results that produce the findings of the kind that I just told you about. Typically, there's a short delay between encoding, for example, DRM list and retrieval. That's just on a few minutes later. And much longer delays are involved in legal cases, weeks, months, or years. We have no idea whether we can make a true-false memory distinction at those long delays. The target populations are different. So lab studies tend to focus on undergraduate participants, much more diverse populations encountered in the courtroom. Another critical point has to do with averaging. So in all the studies I've been telling you about, we're averaging across different individuals in a group to come up with an average estimate of brain activity. We're averaging across a bunch of different lists of items. But in the courtroom, we need to know about one person's memory of a single event. And we don't have evidence that we could put one person in the scanner, ask them about one event, and say with any confidence that it's true or false memory. So even though there have been exciting developments in this area since I wrote The Seven Sins in 2001, I don't think we're at the point where we want to advocate this as a tool in the courtroom. Okay, suggestibility. I'm only going to mention what suggestibility is, implanted memories that can corrupt our memories, because we do have the world's expert here on suggestibility. That's Elizabeth Loftus. You'd be much better off hearing about suggestibility from her than from me. So I will refer you to her excellent article in the Annual Review of Psychology published a couple of years ago, Eavesdropping on Memory, where she reviews a lot of this pioneering work that she and her colleagues have done. But I'm not going to be able to avoid her completely in this talk. I just spoke about her, and in the next segment I'm going to speak briefly about something that she was also involved in. Okay, say a few words about bias, which refers to the retrospective distortions produced by current knowledge and beliefs. And in the book on the Seven Sins, I talked about a few different kinds of biases. I'll just mention one example now, because there's some very interesting recent work related to it. And that's a consistency bias, that we tend to make our memories of past attitudes and beliefs consistent with current attitudes and beliefs. This is something that's fairly pervasive, and we have evidence for it from a variety of different kinds of studies, that we tend to skew the past to make it, in many situations, more consistent with how we currently feel. A classic finding comes from the 1980s. People whose views on political issues have changed over time, it was found, often will incorrectly recall their past attitudes as highly similar to their present ones, but their memories of their past political views are often more closely related to the present view than what actually people said at the time. So what was your view on legalization of marijuana 10 years ago? Well, if you track what people actually said 10 years ago, and you look at what they say now and what they believe now, their memory of what they said 10 years ago is more closely related to their current belief than to what they actually said. So we're making the past consistent with the present. So that's a classic finding. And I can't resist mentioning this very recent study that involves two of your UCI faculty, Elizabeth Loftus and Linda Levine. Very cool study that just came out on false memories for fake news, something we all know about, post-2001, post-2016, I guess, during Ireland's abortion referendum. So they did a really interesting study focused on this referendum. It just came out a couple of weeks ago in Psychological Science, one of the best journals in our field. The Eighth Amendment of the Constitution of Ireland guaranteed the unborn to a right to life, resulting in very restrictive abortion laws. And in May 2018, the yes side overwhelmingly voted to repeal the amendment. So they beat out the no side that voted to preserve it. Now, what these researchers did was before the election, the referendum was held, the week before, they had a large survey of 3,000 adults who said they would be voting. And the survey included some true news stories, but it also included fake news stories, stuff that had not really happened. So they printed a fake headline along with a photo. 2 of these reflected negatively on the yes side, and 2 reflected negatively on the no side. And again, I won't go into all the details and measurements that they did, but what was interesting is that the results revealed a bias in this false memory effect, such that there were more false memories and false beliefs about the stories that reflected negatively on the other side. So when people are seeing a fake news story about something bad about the no side, they're more likely, if they're on the yes side, to claim, oh, I remember that. I remember seeing that. Well, you didn't see it because it didn't happen. And vice versa. So both sides are doing it. So the consistency bias that I talked about seems to be driving this memory misattribution. There's some probably elements of misattribution and suggestibility here, but the bias is the really interesting thing. And the consistency bias was strongest in voters who scored low on a test of general cognitive ability. So they're getting swayed, again, on either side by this bias to a greater extent than folks who score higher. So make of that what you will. But actually, sort of a frightening finding. Okay, I'm just going to say a very few words about persistence and then go on to wrap up. Here, this is an example I've used before, and I felt it was a local example. It's a very sad one of persistence, unwanted recollections that can be devastating psychologically. So some of you may remember a pitcher for the California Angels, when they were called California Angels, playing in nearby in Anaheim, named Donnie Moore. And way back in October 1986, Donnie Moore came in at the end of a critical playoff game against the Boston Red Sox that the Angels were leading. They needed to win that game to move on to the World Series. It looked like they had the game wrapped up. The crowd was standing. His teammates were cheering. Everyone was on to the World Series. Fortunately, Donnie Moore led up a game-losing home run to a guy by the name of Dave Henderson, and the Angels didn't make it to the World Series. The sad thing here is that Donnie Moore could never get that memory out of his mind. It sort of took over his life, and no doubt combined with other factors operating in his life led to a severe depression and ultimately taking his own life. It would be difficult, I think, oversimplifying to say it was just that memory of that event that caused it, though there are people who knew him well who said that was a contributing factor. Well, we've learned a lot about persistence in various ways. One, through basic science studies of the work of pioneers like Dr. McGaugh here, who has been one of the leaders in understanding the neurobiology of memory and emotion. And a lot of his work and others in this topic, and others who have focused on this topic, have taught us that these kinds of highly arousing, persisting memories are likely attributable in part not only to the operation of the hippocampus, more so to this nearby structure, this almond-shaped structure known as the amygdala. And the amygdala, not alone, but working in concert with other regions, seems to play a key role in these emotionally arousing kinds of memories. So we know from many neuroimaging studies now that the amygdala becomes highly active during encoding and retrieval of emotional memories. It's been implicated by many. In fear learning, the work of Joe Ledoux here is particularly well known. And reduced amygdala volume has been found in an extreme form of persisting memory, which you're all probably familiar with in some form or another, known as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, where we're talking about an anxiety disorder that's developed after exposure to a highly traumatic event. So again, the signature finding of PTSD is persistent, frightening thoughts and memories, these intrusive recollections that are very disturbing, often come to mind with great perceptual detail, produces various kinds of unwanted psychological reactions, and can be accompanied by extreme psychophysiologic reactivity. So again, there's been a lot of work on that in the years since. I published 7 Sins of Memory, but I think the basic outlines of our understanding have held up pretty well since then on persistence. Okay, now to my last couple of minutes, I want to ask a question that I hope maybe has occurred to some of you during this talk, and I know some of you have read the 7 Sins book, and so you already know the answer to this question. But it's a basic question of, are the 7 sins really sins? Are they really flaws in memory? Are they really places where Mother Nature and evolution kind of went wrong and left us with a unfortunately flawed memory system? And a main argument of the 7 Sins Memory book is that the answer to that question is no. That rather than thinking of these things as flaws in the memory system, they're prices that we pay for benefits that make memory work as well as it does most of the time. And there's probably no better example of that than persistence. Yes, we can have traumatic experiences that result in memories that keep us up at night and have many undesirable psychological consequences. But as Jim McGaugh has eloquently argued, among others, we want a memory system that is going to preserve those kinds of experiences so that we can avoid threatening, dangerous events in the future, but we pay a price, and the price is that we may have undesirable psychological consequences of this basically highly functional feature of the memory system. So I try to make that argument in various forms. We won't have time now to go through all of them, about each of the 7 sins. And I just want to close by saying a few words about misattribution. So back in 1999, the idea I put forward, and it applies to things like DRM false memories that we talked about earlier, is that many misattributions occur because we typically don't need or want to remember every single detail of every experience. We're good at extracting the gist, the important information. We saw how that might happen in the left temporal pole in the earlier study. We're good at taking away the meaning, general themes of experience. But this can set the stage for misattribution errors, such as the DRM phenomenon. And I still sort of believe that account. I think there's something to that. And I think, in fact, that the temporal pole semantic representation study that we talked about lends some weight to that. There we see there's a part of the brain that's doing absolutely critical work for us, the temporal pole, in terms of providing a foundation for semantic comprehension, understanding concepts and the like, and yet activity in that very region is related to one's susceptibility to the false recognition of a word like sweet. But what I want to tell you about, the final thing, is some more recent developments that involve a new approach, a new adaptive perspective on misattribution, and this is something that was not in my head at all in 2001 when writing the 7 Sins of Memory, but it's actually what has occupied most of my lab's research time for the past dozen years or so. And I'll put this forward in the context of a hypothesis that the neuropsychologist Donna Rose Addis and I put forth in 2007. We called it the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis. So we're focusing in specifically on episodic memory here. And the critical idea here is that episodic memory, which we traditionally think of as referring to our ability to go back in time and reminisce and recollect about all the things that have happened to us in the past, it's not only important for the past, it's also important for thinking about and imagining the future. That's an idea that Endel Tulving had put forward, and we kind of took it in a slightly different direction with this hypothesis. But it's the link to the future here that I'm going to emphasize. And the idea that we put forth back then is that we use episodic memory to imagine possible future scenarios by flexibly taking bits and pieces of elements of our past experience and recombining them to imagine novel episodes. And this ability to flexibly recombine, to take bits and pieces of different memories and form them into something new to think about the future, we think is highly adaptive because the future is rarely identical to the past. We're not just preparing for identical situations. We need to be able to simulate novel situations based on past experience. So the prototype case here would be, imagine you have a difficult conversation with a friend that you've got to prepare for. You want it to go well. You don't want to lose your friendship. So you think about past experiences you've had with that person. You think about similar issues with other people. You kind of recombine them, and then you run simulations of how you might carry out that difficult conversation. Hopefully you do it better by drawing on these bits and pieces of past experience. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about when we talk about using episodic memory to construct episodic simulations of future experience. But the key link now back to memory errors is that we suggested in that paper that this flexible recombination, it's a good thing if you want your episodic memory system to support flexible future thinking. It's great for that, but it can result in memory errors when elements of past experience are miscombined. Think back to Tom Kensinger mixing up those different episodes in the John Doe 1 and 2 case. Maybe that's a consequence of a memory system that's prone to these kinds of errors because it's not really, because a key function of it is to help us use our past experience in a flexible way to think about the future. And indeed, I don't have time to go into this work, but in some recent work from my lab, led by graduate student Alexis Carpenter, we've actually provided some evidence linking flexible recombination and memory misattribution errors, a couple of references there for psychologists in the crowd who might be interested. Well, all this assumes that there's some kind of tight relationship between episodic memory, remembering past experiences, and our ability to imagine into the future. Otherwise, this hypothesis doesn't make any sense. Well, what's the evidence for that? Well, let me just briefly mention a couple kinds of evidence. One of them goes back to the 1980s and an amnesic patient who I tested many times, a patient who in most respects was like HM. He had virtually no ability to remember any particular episode from his past. This is patient KC. That's how I remember him when I was at the University of Toronto testing him on various paradigms in the 1980s. That was him a few years ago, and sadly he died a couple of years ago. He suffered a head trauma as a result of a motorcycle accident in 1980, and again, had basically a complete wipeout of episodic memory. I never saw any evidence that he could remember a single episode, even though his IQ was in the normal range, he could converse normally, and so forth. Well, here's the interesting thing from KC, who had damage to the hippocampus, but he had a head injury, so he had damage elsewhere also. Here's the critical thing about KC that links him to the future, and it goes all the way back to an interview that Endel Tulving conducted with him, where I was sitting right next to Tulving and across the table from patient KC. And we knew what would happen when you asked KC, what happened, what did you do yesterday? He would just say, I draw a blank. He couldn't remember anything. So Tulving asked him a simple question, but it turned out to be very revealing. What do you think you're going to do tomorrow? And he just sat there. Said, nothing comes to mind. It's a blank. With some prodding, he could say, well, I'd have breakfast, then I'd have lunch. But he couldn't conjure up any specific future episode any more than he could remember a past episode. And it turns out that KC was not alone. So again, he said that his mind was a blank when asked that question. There are other amnesic patients. Not every amnesic patient shows this phenomenon. It's been studied now extensively, but many amnesic patients do have difficulties imagining their personal futures or even imagining novel scenes. There have been many studies of aging done in my lab and others in depressed individuals that have shown that older adults and depressed individuals, When they remember past events, they give you fewer episodic details about what happened, where it happened, when it happened, than corresponding controls. And they show exactly the same phenomenon when they imagine into the future. They imagine future episodes with less episodic detail to the same extent that they have difficulty remembering past episodes. And neuroimaging studies, many of them by now, have shown that similar areas are active when we remember the past and imagine the future. So back in 2007, Addis and I did an imaging study where a subject was in the fMRI scanner and they were given a cue word and they were asked to either remember a past event or imagine a future event. So here, if the subject was given a cue word such as vacation, they might remember being on the beach, or if they were given a cue word such as vacation and asked to remember an event that happened to them within the last few years, they would, in the scanner, remember, mentally relive that event. Or in other conditions, we would give them a cue word such as dog and say, imagine something that might happen to you in the near future related to a dog. And they would imagine that event. And we had various control tasks. And the critical finding was that there's very striking similarity in the brain activity patterns that were elicited when people remembered past events and imagined future events. So you can see these midline regions, the retrosplenial cortex, posterior cingulate, medial prefrontal cortex, showing almost identical activity. The hippocampus came online for both, and a couple of other regions did as well. And that led us, in another paper back in 2007, to postulate the existence of what we called a core network that's involved in remembering past events and imagining future events involving those regions that you just saw in the fMRI scan, plus a few other regions that also showed common activity when people remembered the past and imagined the future, including the hippocampus and other parts of the medial temporal lobe. There's been a lot of research in this area since that time, and I think we see there is a very tight connection in the brain and the mind between remembering the past and imagining the future. And so the general implication here, I think, is that memory is not just about the past. It's not just about reminiscing and recollecting. It's also a tool used by the brain to generate simulations, to help us to think into the future, imagine how things may turn out, and hopefully make better plans as a result. And I think this may be one useful way to think of the 7 sins of memory that was not at all in the 2001 book. But I have to say a happy coincidence now is that I'm revising that book to come out for the 20th anniversary edition in 2021. I can't believe 20 years have passed since I wrote that book, but this theme will feature in the updated version. So I want to thank funding sources, many members of my lab, and thank you for your attention.
If we can bring out the house lights just for the next few minutes. Dr. Schacter will stick around and answer just a few questions. We're happy to take those questions. I think we have folks running mics up and down. So once you have somebody identified, just raise your hand and somebody will bring the mic up.
Yeah, thank you for that great lecture. But the first question I have, does your results change depending on the language that you are speaking?
Well, it's an interesting question. Most of our experiments are done just in English, so we don't really know. But I'll give you one example that relates to this last point I was making about the similarity between remembering the past and imagining the future. There's been a lot of concern in psychology about, can we replicate our findings? And there's been concern that certain findings don't replicate. So there was a large-scale replication study done of a large number of studies that were published in 2008. One of those was a study from my lab looking at remembering the past and imagining the future in older adults. It wasn't an exact replication because they did it in a different language, which is coming to your point, but happily, our results replicated. We weren't part of the results that didn't replicate. So at least for that phenomenon, I would say it was done in a different, the experiment was redone in a different language, and the results were the same. I suspect that most of the findings here that I've been talking about would not be sensitive to that, but I guess it's an empirical question ultimately.
Yeah, thanks for a terrific lecture. I'm curious, to get the anti-mind wandering results and the effects, is it enough? So the question is whether the testing you're going to do or you're threatening to do or people are aware might happen in the future, does it have to have stakes? Does it have to be that it's going to be part of your grade? Or is just knowing that you will be asked and have to answer write it down or whatever enough to generate that?
In our experiment, there wasn't really a stake other than people wanted to put forth their best effort. So I would think that stakes would increase it, but I think, at least in the experiments that we've done, we haven't paid them off for not mind wandering, and we've gotten the results. So I think that would likely only enhance it. But we had actually talked about doing some studies to see whether that would add to the effect, but have not done them as of yet.
Thank you so much for a great lecture. I have actually a triple question, and that is regarding your last two slides about remembering the past and imagining the future, the midline structures, and the similarity with the default mode, which is also midline, and that's more related to wandering and self-reflection. And then the work by Jaak Panksepp and the midline structures related to the self, the autobiographical self, which is very much implicit. It's not just explicit. So could you make some kind of summary of these?
Yeah, I think you make a very astute observation that what we're calling the core network there overlaps almost entirely with the well-known default mode network. It's not exactly the same thing. There are a few things that differ between the two. And so the default network comes online when people mind wander. That was an intriguing finding about those regions that was first discovered around the same time that we were finding they come online when people remember the past and imagine the future. And that's probably not surprising because when people mind wandering, they're remembering the past and imagining the future. That's what they're doing. So the two things should be closely linked, and they are closely linked. But I think that some of our findings and some other studies I didn't get to show you, where we've done some studies that show that the default mode network, or core network as I described it here, can couple with executive networks that are involved in goal-directed behavior. So it's not just that this network comes online where we're kind of idly musing. We did studies showing that it couples with executive regions when people are given more complex, goal-directed future planning to do. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And then finally, you raised an interesting question about the role of these individual regions within this network. What do they each contribute to remembering the past, imagining the future? And that's been one of the focal points of work in my lab. I could give a whole other talk on that, but I think I've probably given you enough for tonight.
For the sake of time, I think we're probably going to just have to call it at this point, because I know that it's getting a little bit late in the evening. So let's thank Dr. Schacter one more time. So Dan doesn't know this, but we've got something for him here before you guys go. We want to make sure that we acknowledge Dr. Schacter also for not just being the speaker this time, but really for being a speaker at the CNLM This is, it reads, "In appreciation for your dedication and commitment to public education." So thank you, Dan, for everything that you've done for us over the years.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.